All right. Let me go ahead and get started. And I'm going to continue, kind of circle back to the theme of a lecture series we've been on for a few weeks now. And I did a kind of detour last week, but I am, if you remember, we talked about regulating banks and the question of what we might do to do something about banks that are too big to fail. And I'm now going to return to the main theme of building a better economy. And I'm going to look at the political dimensions of building a better economy today, which of course it's impossible to do this without thinking about politics. And much of what I have to say is about economic policy. But really what I want to look at today is the way in which increased inequality, but also increased concentration of power in the contemporary American economy has undermined American democracy, and how much more difficult that makes than the project of pursuing economic reform. And so hence politics to economics and again. And so let me get started just reintroducing you to the very big themes, right? Which is to say that our economy has become much more unequal. This is familiar terrain at this point, right? And it's not just that the rich have become so much richer, it is that the bottom have become and when I say bottom, I mean the bottom 50%, the people living on $30,000 a year or less in contemporary American economic conditions are absolutely vulnerable, precarious, struggling, and not just struggling to make ends meet, struggling to keep a roof over their heads, struggling to pay their medical bills, etc., but also struggling psychologically, right? And so we see this epidemic of deaths of despair clearly driven by this. And the evidence that we've kind of come full circle from the end of the 19th through the beginning of the 21st century, having experimented with some policies which I've argued in a kind of critique of the New Deal were imperfect policies, but nevertheless were highly effective in reducing inequality. Those policies have now been undercut and replaced with neoliberal policies that have dramatically reduced tax rates and the progressive structure of taxation in the United States, but more generally, policies that promoted the growth of a middle class through home ownership, through good jobs, through unionization, through support from the government, have all been undermined in the last 40 to 50 years. The result being then a return to Gilded Age levels of inequality, or a new Gilded Age. We spoke a little bit about the failure of the response to the 2008 economic crisis last week, when we were talking about banks and the way in which the, in a sense, problem that led to 2008, which is a lot of speculative investment on the parts of banks and the shadow banking industries, the excessive risk that they took, the fact that the mainstream commercial banking sector, the place where people like us just put our deposits, became so entangled with the much more speculative financial investment bank sector that when the speculative bubble bursts, that drags the rest of us down, that the fact that the economy was so dependent upon these large, too big to fail, too big to jail institutions meant that the government had to bail them out, and that as a result, those with the largest shares of wealth, the most diversified portfolios, those who were not investing most of their savings into their homes, their wealth bounced back and actually increased relatively quickly after the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, whereas the rest of us saw our wealth decrease. And it's another one of these scenarios where the worse off you are, the worse off you did, right? And I will just briefly underline that it appears in 2023 we may be right back where we started again, in the sense that we have at least a banking crisis on our hands that seems to have aspects of the same features of 2008, in particular. The fact that so many of our financial institutions again seem to be too systemically important to allow them to fail when they make bad decisions, and that generates an implicit promise on the part of the government to bail these institutions out, which of course encourages them to be all the more risky, speculative in terms of the way they approach their businesses. I don't want to suggest that's the only reason that banks are stressed right now. We went into that last week. Actually, some of this is non-culpable on their parts. It has to do with changes in the economy driven by increased inflation, followed by increased interest rates, changing the value of the assets that they've invested in. But the big picture is that we still have this strong concentration of wealth in financial institutions that are, in a sense, hijacking our political decision making. We can't let them fail. We can't let them pay the price of their own bad decisions without dragging our whole economy down. And this, in the context of today's lecture, represents the way in which power has shifted in general out of the state and into the economy, where the state is now forced to do the bidding of large economic actors. We've talked about a few different books that indicate how the legal system and various kinds of legislation have been instrumentalized to create the unequal wealth in the United States. Today, I want to point you in the direction of a few other books and the combined implication of all of these books. And so if the previous set of books looks at the gaming of the American legal and political system to open the doors to greater inequality, these books look at what greater inequality does to the political system. And so you get a kind of vicious feedback loop. In the past, we've talked about Martin Gillen's, and I'm going to show you the famous diagrams with Benjamin Page from Democracy in America, What Has Gone Wrong and What to Do About It, the earlier book, Affluence and Influence. And the basic claim here is that democracy works better when people are more equal, and that right equality is measured in terms of wealth and income and translates into greater political equality. And so in a more equal society, people have more equal influence over their politics. And on the other hand, in a more unequal society, that influence of ordinary people diminishes. And again, we end up in oligarchic circumstances. Jane Mayer's wonderful reporting for the New Yorker that was then collected into the book Dark Money demonstrates the way in which the campaign finance gutting by the Supreme Court and Citizens United and Kindred Opinions opens the door for our elections being essentially purchased. Another similar work, Nancy McLean, Democracy in Chains, points to the way in which a group of very rich individuals beginning in the 1970s coordinated a plan to create greater intellectual credibility and then cultural influence for those who wanted to dismantle the New Deal institutions. And this then represents what concentrated wealth and income can purchase, right? Gillens and Page are emphasizing fairly direct purchasing of political influence by funding elections and lobbying. McLean, much more emphasizing how if you have a lot of money, you can set up a new economics department at the University of Virginia, for instance. And from there, you can begin to cultivate the kind of economic theory that helps you to make the argument that all regulations are bad regulations. You can fund scholarships for conservative students at American law schools and begin to influence the composition of the judiciary. And so what Page and Gillens are emphasizing is much more direct purchasing of political influence. What McLean is influencing is much more indirect, long-term, slow march purchasing of cultural influence by changing the ideas of critical actors and eventually changing the ideas thereby of the overall culture. Finally, here in Prague, I was just on a panel with Nancy Fraser discussing her book, Cannibal Capitalism. And this is an account of the way in which the form of economy that we have developed in the 21st century, a highly financialized, global, debt-based neoliberal economy, really consumes, devours the political environment on which it relies. Capitalism absolutely relies on the state to print money, to enforce contracts, to protect property. And as we've noted, looking at Katerina Pastor's work in the past, to allow lawyers to use contract and trust and other forms of law, bankruptcy, to insulate a certain class of assets and allow them to circulate as capital, right? And so in all those respects, capitalism depends on the state, but in other respects, capitalism devours the state and undercuts its capacity to operate independently from economic influence. Hence the idea that in 2023, the United States is probably better described as an oligarchy than a democracy. We've talked a little bit about some of the evidence that this is the case. This is stuff we have talked about before, but I do want to return to it. I'm sorry, give me 1 second. I seem to have something going on with my computer. Let me just see here real quickly. Can somebody let me know you are still seeing and hearing me? Is that correct?
Yes,
That's correct.
it's fine.
Okay, good. There was something going on with the computer, but I'm glad it didn't affect our class. So the stunning diagram, right? Again, this has been referred to as the most frightening diagram in American politics that looks at the influence over our elected officials in Congress of three classes of people seeking to influence political decisions. Average citizens, defined in this case as the people in the bottom 90% in terms of income and wealth. And what the diagram shows, again, just to review very quickly, is that the level of support for particular legislation, take gun control as an example, take support for abortion rights as an example. The level of support has no influence, right? Whether it's around 10% of the population or around 90% of the population that supports a particular piece of legislation, no measurable influence on congressional votes. Take now the top 10%. And as you can see, as the top 10% support for legislation goes up, the likelihood that that legislation is going to pass goes up, and it goes up proportionately, responsively, in the way that democracy is supposed to work. And when we refer to an oligarchy here, what we mean is that our representatives respond to the top 10%, but not to the bottom 90%. The evidence is pretty clear, and the explanation is pretty clear as well. One of the limits of this data is that it can't really get at what the top 1% or 0.01% is doing. It has to settle for the top 10% because that's the way in which the data is collected. The top 0.01% is too small to do this kind of survey with. They tend not to answer opinion polls. They've got other things to do. But having said that, where the influence comes from, right? If you look at this diagram, it's stunning, right? So the top 0.01% share of wealth in the United States, that's a tiny little fraction of the population, right? Their share of wealth has gone up from 3% to 11% in a basically 35-year period. Their percentage of campaign funding, right, has gone up and down a little bit, but from less than 20% on average 35, 40 years ago to 40% or higher in recent elections. So why are economic elites listened to by congressional representatives? Because they fund the American electoral process, right? The other group that has influence in the way that it's supposed to is interest groups, right? And again, these are the groups that have the money to pay lobbyists, the groups that write big checks that fund political parties and political action committees. So with all of that in mind, I now want to present a general framework for analysis. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time and try to explain this diagram to you as well as I can. And this is a diagram I've generated. This actually comes out of the talk I just gave at this conference. And I happen to like this diagram. I happen to think it's important for understanding the relationship between democracy and economics in the 21st century, not exclusively economics, but it is very important for economics. And the way I think to start the conversation here is to go back to the 18th century, to think about the context in which the American Constitution was written and the prevalent view of political theorists and activists, constitution writers, framers, etc., of that time. And that view was that essentially the social conditions in which they were trying this radical experiment of creating a government that might be accountable at least to a larger subset of the people, white male citizens, property owners, but slowly but surely that expands. that experiment assumed that the main effort to be made was democratizing the government, building a state in which there were regular elections, and those elections determined who was empowered to make decisions. And working in the background to that as an assumption, I believe, and if you look at the Constitution, I think it's strongly implied, if you look at the actual writings of a Madison, a Jefferson, a Hamilton, a Rousseau, a Condorcet, right? These really important figures in inspiring or actually bringing about the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, that the task was primarily democratizing the state because the broader society and culture were already hospitable to democracy or moving in that direction. And so this is the period of the Enlightenment, the period of the beginnings of capitalism, what's sometimes called the golden moment of liberal capitalism, in which people were organizing primarily small businesses, not yet large firms and corporations. Industrialism hadn't taken hold. And so the assumption was, in a sense, if you democratize the state, it would be met halfway by a supportive social environment. You didn't need independent social legislation, or legislation, as I put it, to secure a hospitable social environment for democracy. And I want to suggest, I hope it's clear, that over the intervening 200 plus years, that assumption has been superseded. And it's not just that our social environment has changed in ways that make it less hospitable to democracy, but also probably that those 18th century thinkers were onto something, right? That democratic revolutions did occur in America and France and Haiti and elsewhere, and eventually began to spread, in part because the social conditions did encourage people to think of themselves as equal and deserving of political liberty and influence. But I suspect, nevertheless, they exaggerated the degree to which the social circumstances were friendly to democracy. Having said all of that, what I really want to say is that in the 21st century, this is absolutely no longer the case. And it has become incumbent on democracy to affirmatively work to secure social circumstances that support political democracy. And there are then two categories that I want to introduce: democratic self-protection, and I define this as a democracy proactively protecting itself against hostile social forces. And the basic model is that democratic self-protection occurs when democracy is relatively strong, when democracy has succeeded in taming hostile forces in the economy, like large corporations or strong concentrations of wealth or global financial flows that make it very hard to regulate your industries because they'll just flee or offshore or shelter their money elsewhere. The democracy has succeeded in taming those aspects of capitalism that can be hostile to it. And at the same time, the very process of doing this has built some confidence in democracy. People see the rewards that they get out of their democratic institutions, some capacity in the state to continue to do this. And so that's democratic self-protection from a hostile social environment. In the alternative category I have here, democratic self-repair. My suggestion is that if democratic self-protection has broken down, and I think it's clearly the case that it has broken down in the 21st century, the measures that were taken in the middle of the 20th century to recover from the Great Depression, the solidarity that grew out of the Second World War, the building of governmental capacity, that has been systematically dismantled in the last 40 years. And so we both no longer have a democracy that is protected from hostile social forces. That's what I've tried to show you in terms of, right, the non-responsiveness of the state to ordinary citizens, but it's, hyper responsiveness to economic elites. And so democracy is damaged. And I'm going to go into some detail on this in a few minutes, but I want to start with a basic paradox here, which is that when democracy is damaged, like it is when it has failed to protect itself from hostile social circumstances, the task of democracy is now twofold. It still has to worry about hostile social forces. It still has to try to regulate inequality. It still has to try to break up concentrations of income, wealth, economic power, to enforce anti-monopoly legislation and to try to redistribute wealth from the hyper wealthy, not only because that's fair and good and benefits those who are less wealthy, but also because that's necessary for political equality to be meaningful and protected. It has to still do the tasks of struggling to secure a hospitable social environment, but at the same time, it has to try to restore ordinary citizens' faith in democratic institutions. It has to try to rebuild governmental capacity, to create a political culture in which people trust each other and have some form of compassion or solidarity for each other. And that also tends to be damaged when democratic self-protection has been neglected. And so I suggest, right, a couple of continuums here, that democratic self-protection is easier when social circumstances are relatively hospitable and harder when social circumstances are relatively hostile. That's a continuum, but I think it's quite clear that with globalization, with rapid technological change, with a breaking down of certain forms of traditional culture and norms that were supportive of democracy, social conditions have become more hostile. And so the task of democratic self-protection would have become more difficult if we would have stayed the course from the middle of the 20th century to the present. But we didn't stay the course. And so that means we're now in relatively hostile social conditions with a relatively weak state and a political culture that does not assist us in rebuilding the strength of the state. That means, right, that our efforts at democratic self-repair are belated. We've neglected this for 40 odd years. And so this means that this paradox of democratic self-protection, we have to try to rebuild democracy at the same time that we have to try to build a social world that is more hospitable to democracy. And doing those two things at once is very difficult. Being overly aggressive overtaxes the resources available to the culture, assumes capacities that the state doesn't have anymore. And so that this is a difficult task. Let me then go into, and like I said, at a conference, I generated this diagram out of the paper I just presented at the conference. And I have to admit, I was a little stunned when I was all done with it. I had tried to synthesize a literature on damaged democracy. And in doing so, I identified 19 respects in which contemporary democracies are damaged. And like I say, I'm a little overwhelmed at the variety of mechanisms that are currently undermining democracy. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. I've categorized them into 8 overall categories. So to begin with, we've had rapid and disruptive technological change, rapid and disintegrative cultural change, right? And so with technological change, I assume that's obvious. Here I am in Prague giving a talk with you in California over computers and televisions, because we live in an age of digital technology, right? Which we all walk around with computers in our pockets that are more powerful than supercomputers and that mesmerize us so that, right, we are the phrase that I came across in some of the research on this, de-worlded, right? You know, am I in Prague or am I in California right now? I'm a little confused because although it's the sun is setting here, it's just rising there. Which place am I? Or maybe I'm no place in the world in particular because I'm really living in and through my technology. Cultural change, right? We've become much less religious. We've become much more fluid in our gender identities. The rate of marriage, the number of children born out of wedlock, the number of people going through a kind of religious churn in which we change our identities over time. All of this is also a big change occurring in our historical and social moment. Economic change, we've talked a lot about that, right? But the good working class jobs, the level of economic security, the expectation of mobility and stability have all been shattered by the economic changes of the last 40 years. Rapid demographic change as well. We've become a much more diverse, multiracial, multicultural society. We've had an African-American president, a biracial female vice president. We are seeing those changes play out in our society. And as I've suggested to you before, right, for at least a segment of the population, you put these 4 things together, and this is a new, alien, disorienting world. And some people, it just puts them in a state, and I think we have to take this seriously, of feeling that they no longer understand the society we live in. It doesn't make any sense to them, and they want to go back to a simpler, more traditional society. The resonance of Make America Great Again is precisely to those people who feel like, you know, implicitly, obviously, Trump is pretty good in this respect at branding, at labeling, at generating slogans. He figured out a way to say, let's go back, that Make America Great Again, that really brought home that message, right? And so this has brought out conservative or authoritarian tendencies. If you want the pace of change in your society to stop or even be reversed, you want somebody strong enough to impose or reimpose order on the society, or to at least hit the brakes on the level of social change. And doing that requires a certain willingness to use state power to arrest social change. And so there are large portions, I don't know, maybe a third of the American public who feel this way to varying degrees. And that creates a tempting target for opportunist political entrepreneurs. Here we are back to Donald Trump. So then to play out the political implications. We've seen a resurgence of anti-immigrant nativism and authoritarian politics, authoritarian populism, right? That idea that the state really has to be used by strong leaders to arrest or reverse all of these threatening kinds of changes in the United States. And it's especially true for us. We had a long history in which being a citizen was equivalent to being white, and that created certain privileges, both material and political, symbolic. And I think that a large part of the resurgence of racial politics, of racism, has to do with the idea that that was a more secure and understandable world for the people who are beneficiaries of that kind of privilege. They want their privilege back. And the result is that major political parties are turning against established democracy or democratic and liberal norms. I'll show you a little bit of evidence on this in a moment, but I think we all know what I'm talking about. This has led to growing political polarization, right? Because a lot of us say, what are you talking about? This change is not all bad, and certainly it doesn't justify keeping immigrants out or undercutting liberal democratic institutions or resorting to racism. And so we end up vilifying the other side, who is already, right, strongly opposed to us. And that undermines what democracy requires to function well: mutual respect, compromise, trust, deliberation, core norms. You add to that the political parties socialize their leaders to respect the norms of democratic institutions and liberal government. And when they become authoritarian populist parties, they tend to turn against those norms. So at the level of ordinary citizens, we're more and more polarized, mistrustful. At the level of political parties, we have anti-institutional parties, and this is undermining democracy. Additionally, right, and as I say, I think it's almost overwhelming that the laundry list, the perfect storm of impediments to democracy we encounter in the second decade of the 21st century. There's a decline in bottom-up civil society-based organizations and mobilization, right? Unions, clubs, social movements, the stuff that Tocqueville in Democracy in America pointed to and said, our democracy in the middle of the 19th century, early 19th century, is an exemplar for the world, because it's not just political elites and parties, it's ordinary Americans organizing things in order to do things for themselves. That makes democracy much stronger. As Robert Putnam and many others have documented, this is just not the case in 21st century America. Similarly, political participation and engagement with electoral politics in general has declined. If it goes back up, it goes back up primarily due to negative partisanship. I'm so scared the other side is going to win. I gotta get out and vote. I kid you not when I say that my father says he wants to live long enough to help to defeat Donald Trump in 2024, right? And so if we are motivated to engage in politics, the motivation is not positive, it's negative. But in general, we've seen these trends of declining voting and participation. This has led to the elite capture and unresponsiveness in democratic institutions of the kind that Gillens and Page demonstrate so clearly in that scary document on non-responsiveness. We then add another critical institution of democracy is the public sphere. How we get our information, how we talk to each other in a democracy of 350 million people is not face-to-face. It's via the media of communication. And there's been a restructuring of the public sphere and of knowledge systems by the new digital media, especially by the many-to-many social media. And so the information that now circulates in different ways. And it's structured by algorithms run by for-profit companies that measure their success based on how many people view their platform and how long they spend on it. And this has led them to promote content on the basis of popularity, what they call virality, right? Does it go viral or not? And the capacity to grab your attention, which tends to be correlated to the capacity to promote or prompt strong emotions, not truth or verifiability. That's met halfway by what I'm calling the credulity, the willingness to believe whatever confirms their identity or makes them feel like they are right to believe what they believe, of large portions of the demos, the population of our societies. So to disinformation and conspiracy theories that better match their feeling structures. You know, we feel like the state doesn't respond to us anymore. Well, QAnon has a pretty good explanation for that, and it's a little bit less complicated. It's a little bit less elite or liberal than the kind of explanation I'm offering, and substantial portions of the population subscribe. Therefore, it appears, to the QAnon belief system. The result is, of course, that a substantial portion of the population is, if you will, hooked by the QAnon suggestion. I've got a clear-cut finger I can point. Why is it that the government doesn't respond to you anymore? It's been captured by this devil worshiping, child abusing cabal. And that helps then to explain why you're becoming more precarious, why you don't have as much influence anymore. But that is clearly not healthy for a democracy when disinformation, lies circulate as readily as truths, and it's really hard to tell the difference between them. This is directly related to what I've referred to. I like my phrase probably too much, algorithmically amplified affect. Our phones, our platforms, our social media addictions, right? And people under 30 spending 6 hours a day or more on social media, they are designed to capture our attention by working on our emotions, by making us feel angry or anxious. And the effect of a information stream that says there's a lot to be angry about, there's a lot to be scared about, is that we're not just angry and scared when we're looking at the social media. It influences our overall emotional state. And again, I think we see this in all kinds of forms of political behavior. Two more categories to go here. I know it's a little exhausting to document everything that's wrong with democracy today. We have outdated democratic institutions, and we've spoken a little bit about this in previous lectures. We've got an 18th century constitution. I've tried to give you a little bit more information today about why that's so problematic. It's built for a social world that meets democracy halfway, at least so we thought, a hospitable social world. And so it doesn't contain the powers, the levers, the instruments necessary to begin to exercise social control over a 21st century economy or social world. And maybe it was last updated, if at all, in the 20th century, thinking about the growth of the administrative New Deal state. But as I've tried to document to you before, right, the grafting onto the 18th century Constitution of 20th century administrative regulations and bureaucracies really tries to compensate for the antiquated institutions, but it does so in ways that are not particularly effective nor particularly democratically accountable. And so we need to really rethink the way in which our state operates for the 21st century. This then brings us to a final cluster of issues, which have to do with the fact that so much of what affects us, whether we're talking about climate change or artificial intelligence or globalization in the economy, is supranational, transnational, global, right? Ecological, technological, and economic crises all seem to have that feature to them. But our democracy is still primarily organized at the level of the nation state, and so doesn't seem to be well suited to address these concerns. So now I've tried to convince you. Imagine the evidence is a little overwhelming, that we have neglected democratic self-protection, and so we need to do democratic self-repair, and that in a sense, the condition we're in 2023 is a difficult one, where we have to do democratic self-repair at the same time that we have to try to do our best to influence the social environment of democracy in the context of what we're talking about today. What's most important is that we intervene in the economy to reduce inequality, to reduce concentrations of power, but that's especially hard when in all these respects, not just the state, but democracy as a whole has been weakened. So what approach should we take? And here I want to write, I'm sorry, I guess I'm going to spend a moment just refreshing your memory, stuff we talked about together recently, that the Republican Party has become an anti-establishment party, one of our two main parties, right? And that it is increasingly not just susceptible to, but in fact promoting disinformation. For instance, you heard Donald Trump on CNN a couple nights ago, right back to the lies about the 2020 elections. The majority of Republican candidates running for office a year ago promoted or did not deny the big lie, right? And this is just one form of channeling mistrust of mainstream institutions. Don't believe what the host on CNN is saying. Don't believe what the New York Times is saying. Don't believe what the Attorney General is saying. Don't believe what the state election officials are saying, because they are all part of a rigged system. And it appears that a substantial portion of our population will buy that today. Perhaps not substantial enough to win, let us hope, national election, but particularly given the way in which American political institutions are structured, enough to capture Congress, enough to therefore paralyze the political process. And again, that means that we can't even do the work of democratic self-repair, let alone begin to address economic inequality. This is then, and again, a little bit more evidence about what's happening, the degree of partisan rancor, right? And so is it okay to threaten or intimidate, to harass, to do violence against your partisan opposite, right? It's only around 10% of the population, but when 1 in 10 people are willing to threaten, intimidate, harass, do violence against people from the other party, democracy is clearly in danger. And then the higher, right, so that's behavior, this is belief, the very high levels, right, of people saying that the other party is a threat to the United States, a serious threat. 60% of people in recent surveys that they're not just worse for politics, they're downright evil. 40%, right? That they are perhaps not fully human, more like animals, almost 20%. And then unsurprisingly, given that background, we see large portions, and this is really concentrating on Republican and Republican leaning voters, willing to use force to save their way of life, willing to take the law into their own hands if they don't like the way institutions are functioning, willing to back strong leaders who bend the rules, and mistrustful of elections, right? So now let me pivot back to the question of what we can do to change the economy, given the way in which the failure to regulate the economy has not just made us a more unequal society, but has weakened democracy in the United States. And so these are ideas I've shared with you in the last few weeks, but I want to return to them now with that background. And so what I tried to do is outline what I'm calling guideposts for democratic political economy. What is it that we want out of our economy in order to make it more favorable for democracy, in addition to being fair and just? And I think there's an implicit strategy here that I've taken for granted that I now want to make explicit with you. And that strategy is to really start with the very idea of democracy, with what I take to still be perhaps the last widely and deeply shared political commitment in the United States. And having said that, I don't think it's nearly as secure as it has been in the past, and that distresses me, but I still think it's the best starting place for our political arguments, and to articulate on the basis of the value of democracy some sense of what we want from our economy, right? And so then the values here are meant to be democratic values. They're not liberal values. They're not redistributive values. They're not socialist values. They're values that, if you value democracy, you should also want this from your economy. And I think part of the strength of this strategy is to be able to say that the neoliberal, the deregulatory, the regressive values have been shown to be anti-democratic, right? And so to review briefly, non-domination. We don't want such large concentrations of economic power that we no longer feel that we can equally influence our political process, or that we're dominated in economic contexts. Democratic sovereignty over the basic structure of the political economy. We want to feel that by participating in elections, by voting, by participating in the broader life of a democracy, we actually have some influence over the most important circumstances of our lives. And of course, how we work, what the working conditions are, whether we're treated with respect and dignity, but also what the economic consequences of participating in the economy are. Those are fundamentally important circumstances of life, right? we need, and this will be more controversial, a society without systematic status subordination. That is to say, without it mattering hugely for your life chances, whether you're Black or white, whether you're Native or immigrant, whether you're Latino, etc. Right, and so we do also have to think about a system of economic opportunity that allows people equal opportunity, irrespective of race or national background, once they are legally in this country, at least. We don't want excessive social inequality. I think that's clear, because that tends to erode trust, cooperation, well-being, and solidarity. And so we need to bound that in a much narrower range. We've got about 5 more minutes. Okay, I'm so sorry. Yeah, 5 more minutes. I am going to have to end this pretty quickly. The room I'm in actually adjoins a room that somebody's staying in, and he's not feeling well, and I'm disturbing him. But I think we're coming up on our time. I'll just very quickly say again, good jobs, right? We're an affluent enough society that people don't just want a job, they want a job that respects them, that they feel is secure and humane, comes with decent benefits and some opportunity to use some of their intelligence, their creativity, basic economic security and meaningful economic opportunity. Then we get into other things that are essential, right, in the 21st century, environmentally sustainable economy, and some sense of, right, not just offloading our problems onto the shores of other societies. And so here I'm just going to put on the board stuff that we started talking about and that we'll have to go back to talking about. But what I want to suggest is that there's just a wealth of policy options for us here. It's tremendous how many different options we have to pursue those values. I won't go into the details today, right? But there's stuff that's more ameliorative, make people less vulnerable and precarious in the 21st century. And then stuff that's really about pursuing democracy, break up too big to fail financial institutions, try to regulate the 21st century economy in the way that we did in the middle of the 20th century to make financial institutions less powerful and less predatory. Tax reform so that we tax wealth and income inequality, and then use that to fund things that undermine both status inequality and promote equality of opportunity. I will stop there. Happy to take questions for just a few minutes in light of my circumstances here. Is the approach to addressing the paradox of self-repair clear here? Is the paradox itself? Who wants to start us out? Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with your observations about the nature of the problem and your proposals for a solution, but I wanted to add one sort of overview on it, I guess, and that is that I think that while conceptually and even ideologically, these are at least national and maybe even global concerns, I think we have to look locally at where the action plays out in the two fields that I know best, environment and education. It isn't the national, and certainly not the federal level at which a lot of mischief gets done. It's at the state level and it's at the local level, as evidenced, for example, by lots of states pushing back on climate action by putting forth regulations that actually penalize financial institutions for their attempts to penalize agencies that foul the environment with their fossil fuel production. And some states, Texas, for example, now has penalties going the other way. And in the field of education, there's a national Republican agency, I don't remember what it's called, that actually produces model legislation for states and model local actions for like school boards and the like. And they basically write the law for you. And if you look at the similarity of laws governing book banning or how to teach early reading or math, they have a remarkable similarity across sites. But the political action takes place locally, where it's easier for a very well-defined group to take control.
Yeah, and so I believe the group you may be talking about, there are a couple of them, but one of them is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They actually refer to their approach as an IKEA model, right? So, you know, IKEA, you take it off the shelf, you take it home, you assemble it. They have a legislative package for you to take to your state legislature, already pre-drafted, and then they'll even bring the experts in for testimony. They write their speeches for you. So yes, there's a lot of state pushback, particularly on environmental legislation, and there's a lot of opportunism around cultural politics with regards to education. Having said that, let me try to differentiate those two for a second. I like this observation that America doesn't have an education system, right? It has 1,000 education systems, so, you know, 1,000 different school districts, and then each school district pretty much on its own boat, although the latitude for school districts in conservative states to do what they want to do is still kind of limited, right? So having said all that, I think what you say absolutely fits the case with education. That's in part because the way the education system is structured. Now, I think you're right that what I've said concentrates on what are, naturally speaking, federal legislative efforts. Having said that, I think, frankly, that the federal government is the primary locus of the power, the leverage, the levers we need to change a lot of this stuff. And so I'll pivot to the environment here for a second. Again, I don't dispute what you're saying, right? There are now probably a dozen states that have passed legislation that punish financial institutions, that try to offer their customers alternatives to investing in fossil fuel, or even try to decarbonize, quote, their economic models, right? And they get punished for doing that. But having said that, I think that's more symbolic than effective. And I don't want to say it doesn't have some effect. There are almost certainly going to be lawsuits around this legislation. We'll see if it actually holds up in court. But having said that, I imagine you've seen that the tax incentives that were built into the Inflation Reduction Act to promote solar, to promote wind, to promote the production of a green energy infrastructure, to promote electrical vehicles and charging stations. These are primarily tax credits, so essentially federal government subsidies for these proposals have been taken up at almost 10 times the rate at which it was anticipated that they would be taken up when the legislation was drafted and the cost estimate was done. And I think this really shows, again, the power of the federal government to really nudge the overall economy of the United States in the direction that we want it to move. I absolutely think that we can't just redo New Deal administrative policy. We have to have 21st century administrative policy to respond to 21st century economic and social conditions, but also to open up the administrative state to democratic input and accountability, right? And that, in a sense, one of the big weaknesses of the New Deal, what was this sense, we'll just give it to experts and we'll have to trust them. And that opened the administrative state to the New Deal criticism. So we need new approaches, but I do think the federal government is not the sole place where the action is. That you're absolutely right. It has to be local, it has to be state, it has to be federal. In certain respects, it has to be transnational as well, depending on the problem and where the levers are. But we can't say it's all local or it's all state, as opposed to it's multi-level, it's a multi-front battle, and those battles have to be fought simultaneously. Really interesting observation. Again, David, thank you. Flossie, I see you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself, and then we can hear your question or comment.
Hear me now?
Yes, just fine. Thank you.
I am worried about what the Supreme Court can do to anything that the federal government presents, because the court is corrupt now.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
My comment is, it's not going to be easy, right? And so let us remember, the last time the United States set down a path like this in the early 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt started offering his New Deal legislation, the vast majority of it was struck down by the Supreme Court, right? It took a clear indication that the majority of the American public was opposed to what the court was doing, then resignations and deaths on the court, and then a change in the composition and the direction of the court. I'm not saying that we replay that scenario, but I'm saying we have to digest the lessons of that, which is this doesn't happen easily. We have to overcome impediments. Our democracy is damaged. It needs to be repaired. We can't just start implementing as if we could wave a wand all of this good policy and let it start working, right? You know, getting the Inflation Reduction Act passed, you remember all the talk we did about Manchin and Sinema and the blockage in the Senate. Large portions of it got cut, things that would be incredibly beneficial for addressing precariousness in American society, for making daycare and housing security and education better, eliminated from that legislation in order to get it passed. But it did get passed, and now we're beginning to see really important changes on climate policy as a result. And so far, touch wood, the Supreme Court really has not undermined that legislation. And as much as I share your mistrust of the hard right supermajority on the court, two things. First of all, they are bound in certain respects by the rule of law, right? Because they're a court. If they just start willy-nilly doing what they want to do, they lose the nature of the legitimacy that they have. That's already eroded. It's already perceived to be a more political institution. And then the second thing then is that I think the court is actually getting worried. You know, it struck down Roe v. Wade, and all of a sudden, the Republican coalition that created that court looks a lot more fragile because you have a lot of women, 5% of the voters who voted for Republicans in part because they thought, Roe v. Wade is protected by the court. We can elect anti-abortion politicians. They can't really do anything. Watch out what you wish for, right? And so I do think the court may be doing a little bit of political calculus. They want to preserve their own legitimacy, and frankly, they don't want to be the catalyst for mobilizing a bloodbath for the party that most of them belong to and owe their power to. I really do think I better go today. I've got somebody joining the room I'm in, unfortunately is not feeling well. And we have had a full, long discussion today. I will see you stateside again next week. Everybody be well, take care. Look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Bye-bye.